Alrighty, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And I would like to welcome you to the Future of Our Oceans webinar series brought to you by Oceans at Duke. Oceans at Duke is an interdisciplinary network of faculty and students from across all the schools of Duke University who are committed to ocean science and sustainability. Our community of scholars is working together to apply cutting-edge insights from ocean science, governance, and business to tackle the ocean's most urgent challenges and opportunities. We thank you for joining us for this webinar series, where we explore a range of compelling topics, including the future of marine conservation areas, the role of oceans in human health, the drivers and risks of deep sea mining, solutions for plastic pollution, and the evolution of the blue economy, among others. We highlight the latest work of Duke University researchers while also engaging experts, colleagues, and other stakeholders connected to these challenges. Our purpose is to inform, inspire, and enable you to help ocean ecosystems and communities to flourish. Let me provide just a few guidelines for today. The session will be 60 minutes, including our speakers' presentations and a question and answer session in the last 10 minutes or so. Your cameras and microphones are not functional for the session, but we encourage you to share your questions, comments, thoughts in the question and answer box, which will be monitored by our team. We also encourage you to go to the Oceans at Duke website, linked to your registration, to see additional articles and resources related to our topics, details on faculty research, and descriptions of past and future webinar sessions. Today's session will also be recorded and posted within about a week. Okay, so to get started, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Nicole France, who will present first, and then we'll introduce subsequent speakers. Nicole is a development economist with 18 years of experience in intergovernmental organizations. She holds a master's in international cooperation and project design from the University of La Sapienza in Rome, and a master's in economic cultural cooperation and human rights in the Mediterranean region. From 2003 to 2008, she was a consultant for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. 2009 to 10, she was a fisheries planning analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in Paris, focusing on fisheries certification. Since 2011, she has worked for the FAO Fisheries Division, where she coordinates the implementation of the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, the SSF guidelines, with a focus on inclusive policy processes and stakeholder empowerment. Since 2021, she has led the reorganized FAO Equitable Livelihoods team, which continues this work on the voluntary guidelines. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Nicole to begin our conversation. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Professor Novacek. It's a pleasure and a privilege to join all of you here today. Small-scale fisheries are vital for lives and livelihoods, for food and nutrition, for local cultures, and for communities. And for many fishers and fish workers who engage in small-scale fisheries, especially indigenous peoples, fishing is in fact more than just a job. It's really a way of life. And that said, the contribution of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development are often undervalued or overlooked. This results in missed opportunities to progress the sustainable development goals. And in the worst instances, small-scale fishers, fish workers, are experiencing increased marginalization and exclusion from governance, from spaces, and from resources. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or in short, the FAO, Duke University, and WorldFish teamed up in 2017 to help address this issue by launching the Illuminating Hidden Harvests study on the contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development. This study is inspired by a 2012 Hidden Harvest report that was produced by the World Bank, FAO, and WorldFish. The aim of this new Illuminating Hidden Harvest, or IHH study, is to generate and disseminate new evidence about the contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development and to inform policy and practice. The broader IHH initiative is expected to further improve methods and capacities to collect, analyze, and use data and information on small-scale fisheries as a basis for sound and inclusive policymaking and resource governance. And we hope that many Duke students can continue to contribute to this, including under the FAO Duke University Memorandum of Understanding that we have. But back to what we want to do here today, to share key findings of this Illuminating Hidden Harvest study with you. We will first hear about the IHH approach and then zoom into specific results in relation to harvesting, to economics, to gender, to nutrition, and to governance. And we will also present for the first time preliminary results from a complementary research stemming from IHH on securing access for small-scale fisheries. And after that, as you heard already from Doug, we will have about 10 minutes to answer your questions and hear your comments. And with this, I hand over to Mar Mancha-Cisneros, who dedicated her Duke University postdoc to IHH. She co-led the methodological design, the training of country case study experts in 3 different languages, and the data compilation, among other key tasks. Ma, over to you, please.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello, everyone. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Mar Mancha-Cisneros. I was a postdoctoral associate at the Duke University Marine Lab, working as technical lead for the Illuminating Hidden Harvests project, or as we call it, IHH. And I'm going to start with an overview of the approach taken by the IHH study. Recognizing small-scale fisheries as complex socio-ecological systems, IHH took a multidisciplinary approach, which is closely embedded with the Sustainable Development Goals framework. As we can see from the figure, as well as the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, and particularly as a response to the call for better data within the small-scale fisheries guidelines. Particularly, IHH looks at the contributions of small-scale fisheries to the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, with a strong focus on nutrition and governance as well, and with gender as a cross-cutting dimension. The main data source for the study was a series of 58 case studies that were carried out in the countries and territories you see highlighted in the map, which were selected according to a series of indicators and that accounted for 68% of global marine catch and 62% of inland global catch, according to FAO data. The country and territory case studies were carried out by national research institutes, fisheries organizations, local and international fisheries experts for a total of more than 800 contributions, with the objective of compiling available data and information on small-scale fisheries at country level, including official statistics, surveys, expert knowledge, and so on, following a standard protocol that was provided by the IHH team. Gender focal points were also identified within the countries and territories to support the case studies experts on data collection to flesh out all the available data and knowledge on gender and small-scale fisheries, including gender disaggregated data to estimate contributions by women and men in small-scale fisheries, for example, in terms of fisheries labor, and highlighting specific gaps and limitations in the available data. Other data sources included to complement and fill gaps, as well as triangulate country case study data, were responses to an ad hoc questionnaire on small-scale fisheries that was sent to FAO member countries and territories, for which we received 104 responses as well. Existing global and regional databases, literature reviews, labor force surveys, and household income and expenditure surveys were another source of data. Finally, specific thematic studies were also carried out in order to highlight key aspects of small-scale fisheries that cannot be quantified at global level. For example, a study on indigenous peoples and identity. As we all know, there is no international agreed definition of small-scale fisheries. Therefore, the IHH study did not prescribe a definition for it. Instead, our country case study experts were instructed to use the most commonly used definition for small-scale fisheries in their country for the data compilation. However, the IHH study did use a tool called the Characterization Matrix that allowed us to score each fishery included in this study according to a series of characteristics such as gear used, motorization, distance from shore, etc., in order to place them along the continuum between small and large-scale fisheries, and to give a better sense of what we really are looking at when we talk about small-scale fisheries in the study. Finally, data compiled through the different approaches were analyzed and extrapolated to produce global estimates of the key indicators, such as catch and employment, but also to use to gain better insights on issues that are very important for small-scale fisheries at different spatial scales, such as a national or subnational level, in addition to those aspects highlighted in the thematic studies that cannot be quantified at global level, yet recognizing the high diversity of small-scale fisheries. We want to take this opportunity to thank the IHH Technical Advisory Group, who advised on the design, analysis, and interpretation throughout the way, listed here in the slide. But as we mentioned earlier, IHH took a multidisciplinary approach, illustrated by this diagram, and put a stress on the interconnections among the different dimensions and related questions in order to draw a holistic picture of small-scale fisheries to highlight their overall contributions, benefits, and impacts. And by looking at the data through the lens of different disciplines at the same time. We will hear more details on the results of this other analysis undertaken within IHH in the rest of the webinar. Starting with the first question, how much fish comes from small-scale fisheries? With this, I'm going to present next on harvesting and the environmental dimension of the IHH study. This part of the study was led by our colleagues Simon Finch-Smith and Nicolas Gutierrez, which with help from IHH project coordinator Julia Gorelli and myself, all three of them who work for FAO and are core team members of the IHH initiative. Let's start by understanding what is the contribution of small-scale fisheries to the global fisheries catch. In this figure on the right, we see total global fisheries catch estimated by the IHH study, with a total of 92.1 million tons, from which 40% or almost 37 million tons are coming from small-scale fisheries, and 60% is from large-scale fisheries. However, if we look at these patterns at a regional level, we see the share of small-scale fisheries catch is highly variable across regions, being highest in Africa and Asia with 66% and 46% respectively, and lowest in Europe with only 5% of total catches coming from the small-scale fisheries sector. Now let's take a look at how small-scale fisheries catches are distributed between marine and inland, the marine and inland sector. At the global level in our study, 68% of total catches come from marine small-scale fisheries, and the other 32%, or the other third, come from inland small-scale fisheries. When looking at regional patterns, almost half of the catch in Africa comes from the inland sector, highlighting the absolute importance of these fisheries for the continent. For the Americas and intuitively in Oceania, the importance of the inland fisheries sector in terms of catch volumes is low, between 5 and 10%. The next question is, how are different species groups represented in small-scale fisheries catches? Identifying fisheries catch and at the species or higher taxonomic levels has a positive impact in how these fisheries are monitored, assessed, and managed. However, only 63% of marine small-scale fishery catches and 40% of inland small-scale fisheries catches have been identified in our study at family levels. From this sample, carps, tilapias, and small pelagic species dominated the inland reported catch. The generally poor quality of reporting at species level in inland fisheries severely limits deeper analysis of the resilience of inland fisheries and their economic and nutritional importance. For marine small-scale fisheries, the most represented species groups included small pelagics, such as sardines, herrings, and anchovies, and other pelagic fish, such as mackerels, scats, and tunas. This adds up to almost 50% of the total marine small-scale fisheries catch. As you will see in the following presentations, IHH is a lot more than understanding the catch contributions small-scale fisheries make, and the amount, quality, and granularity of the information collected has allowed us to tackle many other questions to better understand the harvesting and environmental dimensions of small-scale fisheries. For instance, we have data that allows us to disaggregate catches by species, gears, fleets, and ecosystems. We have information that can provide a global synthesis of small-scale fisheries fleets, including catch efficiencies and the nature and scale of the operations. For example, crew size, distance from shore of fishing activities, and other aspects such as use of some sort of onboard refrigeration. We are also using available data and literature reviews to better understand small-scale fisheries interactions with the environment. For example, detrimental effects to critical habitats, the impacts of small-scale fisheries on vulnerable species, including threatened species. And we also shed some light into the impacts of climate change in small-scale fisheries, including some policy recommendations on mitigation and adaptation strategies. So to come back to our initial question on how much fish comes from small-scale fisheries, we found that 37 million tons, or 40% of the global catch, originates from small-scale fisheries. Next, my colleague John Verdon will look into the people behind this catch to better understand how many people depend on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods. Over to you, John.
Great, thank you so much, Mar, and hi, everyone. As Mar mentioned, I'm John Verdon at Duke's Nicholas Institute, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic contributions of small-scale fisheries to society on behalf of my colleague Nicole and all of the other wonderful colleagues and collaborators that you see listed here. And as Mar mentioned, the main question that we really set out to try to answer here is how many livelihoods are dependent upon small-scale fisheries? And when we went to answer that, we were able to benefit from 78 national household-based surveys conducted from around the world, for which we extrapolated to estimate that 60 million people worldwide are employed either part-time or full-time in small-scale fisheries. And then in addition to that, we found that this represented 90% of all capture fisheries employment worldwide. So just to recap quickly, that small-scale fisheries represented about 90% of all the employment along the value chain in capture fisheries. But beyond employment, we also looked at those that were engaged just in small-scale fisheries for subsistence at some point during the year, and found another 53 million people engaged in small-scale fisheries just for subsistence. And that gave us a total of 113 million people participating in small-scale fisheries, either for subsistence at some point during the year or employed along the value chain. Then looking at these surveys, we found an additional 379 million household members in the households of those people employed or participating in the fisheries for subsistence, giving us this estimate that 492 million people around the world in 2016 depended at least partially on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods, either were employed part-time or full-time along the value chain, were participating in the fisheries for subsistence at some point during the year, or were their household members. And this comes to about 7% of the global population at that time, and 13% if you look at those countries that are considered least developed countries, showing that for lower income countries, these livelihoods are a bigger proportion of the population than the global total. So beyond that, beyond livelihoods, we also looked at the total value, the total economic value of the small-scale fisheries catch, acknowledging that, of course, for socioeconomic contributions, economic contributions of small-scale fisheries to society, we need to look much broader than just the economic value of the catch, but acknowledging that this is an indicator that governments use a lot in decision-making, and one for which we could get data. So we were able to find data for the total revenues generated from the first sale of the catch, which on average was $77 billion for both small scale, for both marine and inland. And then when you break that down, you have 58 billion of first sale revenue from marine small scale fisheries and 19 billion from inland small scale fisheries. For the countries where we had both small and large scale fisheries, which were 58 case studies around the world, 58 countries, we found that on average, the small scale fisheries generated almost half, about 44% of the total revenues from the first sale of the fish catch. Again, giving you a sense of how significant a role small scale fisheries play in the economic value generated from these fisheries around the world. And just when we take this measure of revenues and we put it in the context that we hear so much about of the wider ocean economy, it actually shows that at least for marine small scale fisheries, they measure pretty well against some of the world's largest ocean-based industries, certainly smaller than oil and gas or shipping, but larger than import activities, offshore wind, cruise tourism, right there firmly in the middle by revenues of some of the world's largest ocean-based industries. And remember, we're just looking here at the harvesting segment of small-scale fisheries. Now, we didn't, and you'll see in the report of the study, we didn't look just at livelihoods and economic value of the catch. We also look at some case studies to see the role of small-scale fisheries in international trade, and find that exports are a key feature of a number of the small-scale fisheries that we looked at. We tried to understand subsistence fishing patterns better, and particularly look at the role of small-scale fisheries in local economies, which so often gets kind of masked or hidden in national economic statistics. And then lastly, we're able to disaggregate some of these data on livelihoods, employment, subsistence, a little bit more by the chain, the segment of the value chain, by, as we mentioned, inland and marine, and by gender. So there's certainly much more there in the economic chapter of the Illuminating Hidden Harvest study than we have here. So now that I've finished with that section and said, what is the answer to how many people depend, at least partially, on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods around the world? I want to go to this other point about gender and look at how do women contribute to and benefit from small-scale fisheries. And this work on the gender theme was led by our colleagues Danica Kleiber and Sarah Harper, with a lot of wonderful contributions and insight from the wide group of collaborators that you see listed here. And so when we looked at this, one of the first things I want to say here is that small-scale fisheries cannot be understood without considering gender. And then when you consider gender in small-scale fisheries, it really requires confronting this persistent absence of women in the already limited data that we have available on small-scale fisheries. And this quote here from a colleague in Nigeria gives you one example of just one of the many reasons why that data gap persists. That in Nigeria, net making is considered an extension of women's reproductive or household activities, and so is not included in the censuses of fisheries employment. So, beyond this, in this study, we set out to try to estimate the contributions by women and men to small-scale fisheries, and to understand why gender disaggregated data, and especially the data that highlights the contribution by women, are so often limited and so limited. And so we were able to provide a more robust set of gender disaggregated data, and that showed us that globally, 45 million women participate in small-scale fisheries, either employed along the value chain or participating for subsistence. And this represents about 40% of all small-scale fisheries labor, or put differently, 4 out of 10 people participating in small-scale fisheries are women. And then when we break that down by segments of the value chain or within small-scale fisheries, we find women represent 15% of the pre-harvest labor, such as gear fabrication, repair, bait and ice. They represent 19% of commercial harvesting segment, including vessel and non-vessel based activities. And then when you look at the post-harvest sector, such as processing, transport to market, sale, women represent half of all those engaged in the post-harvest sector. And then 45% of those engaged in subsistence fishing at some point during the year. So that's to give you a sense of the contribution of women to the labor and small-scale fisheries and livelihoods. Beyond that, there are a number of other highlights in the chapter of the Illuminating Hidden Harvest study on gender. For example, that while women participate in small-scale fisheries in substantial numbers, they're underrepresented in governance arenas and face significant barriers to meaningful participation in decision-making. And finally, in many contexts, women, and especially certain groups of women, have less access to, but stand disproportionately to benefit from small-scale fisheries, especially income and nutrition-related benefits. And in this next presentation that's coming up from my colleague Javier, we're going to hear more highlights from the study on the distribution of nutrition-related benefits of small-scale fisheries, including those related to women and to gender. So now that we've highlighted the substantial contribution of small-scale fisheries by women to small-scale fisheries, I want to pass the mic to my colleague Javier for a presentation on nutrition and governance in small-scale fisheries. So Javier, over to you.
Thank you, John. Again, I'm one of the co-leading investigators of the IHH Research Initiative. And so to answer how is small-scale fisheries catch important to nutrition, I will report on the work of on behalf of my colleague, David Mills from WorldFish, who coordinated this fantastic group of co-authors here. And so in the years since the first Hidden Harvest report, the nutrition contribution of small-scale fisheries has increasingly come into focus. This has been driven to varying degrees by the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the strong voice of fishers and their organizations through the small-scale fisheries guidelines that were mentioned before by Mar. IHH provides us then with a unique opportunity to illuminate this contribution and develop methods that can improve the incorporation of nutritional outcomes in fisheries management. So one of the key methodological innovations employed in this study was predictive modeling of the nutrient composition of fish. Conducting analysis of the nutrient content of fish is expensive, and quality data only exists for a small number of species globally. However, through predictive modeling, we can use the characteristics of fish shown in the slide and those species for which we do know the nutrient composition of to predict nutrient values for any species. As a spin-off from this and other linked work, these models have been incorporated into FishBase, and now anyone can access the modeled nutrient values for use in research and management. Using the detailed landings from the IHH country case studies, we looked at the relative nutritional value of different fish groups shown in this slide. We found that while all the fish provide a good diversity of macro and micronutrients, there are some substantial differences and some nutritional hero species. This graph shows the potential contribution of a 100-gram serving of fish flesh from each group to the recommended nutrient intakes of 6 nutrients for women of reproductive age. The most nutritious fish with the best diversity of nutrients were small fish, particularly those living in midwater, the pelagic species. These are often the most available and affordable fish to rural populations too. We applied these predictive nutrient values to IHH regional extrapolations for small-scale fisheries catches to estimate regional nutrient yields. Direct nutrient yield numbers are difficult to understand. So we express this as the number of people for whom small-scale fisheries catches could meet recommended nutrient intakes, RNI, in the figure. Given that a healthy diet contains multiple food groups, we look at how fish can contribute as part of a diverse diet. So omega-3 fatty acids, important for brain development and growth in infants, and to protect against heart disease in adults, are only available from a very limited number of foods. The omega-3 fatty acids in small-scale fisheries landings could provide up to 50% of the recommended daily intake to 150 million women in Africa and 773 million women in Asia. Similarly, the total nutrient yield for small-scale fisheries landings could provide 20% of the recommended daily intake across the 4 most abundant nutrients: calcium, selenium, zinc, omega-3 fatty acids you see on the screen, to about 137 million women in Africa and 271 million women in Asia. In addition to this modeling approach, we worked with country case study teams to identify high-quality data on nutrient outcomes for small-scale fisheries. But this type of data was rare. In a few data bright spots, we undertook in-depth analysis to answer questions about who benefits from the nutrition value of small-scale fisheries. So for example, in Zambia, we were able to use national scale consumption survey data to show that fish are particularly important in maintaining dietary diversity among Zambian children. As shown here, only 18% of children showed adequate dietary diversity. This is defined as consuming 5 or more food groups. Among those achieving the recommended minimum of or higher, meat was important in driving diversity. Meat was the 5th most consumed group. featuring strongly in the diets of those who consume 5 or more food groups. And 58% of meat consumed by children was fish. This reinforces the critical nature of fish, and in this case, inland small-scale fisheries, in supporting positive nutrition outcomes in vulnerable groups. Also included in the nutrition chapter of the report, you will find an analysis of major food safety issues and factors that can improve safety outcomes in the small-scale fishery value chains. You will also find a detailed look at the importance of small-scale fisheries in the first 1,000 days of life, and case studies of how improved nutrition data can illuminate key areas for management and investment to support the important nutritional outcomes from these fisheries. So you have seen that small fish from small-scale fisheries are often particularly important for nutrition among vulnerable populations. That the fish from small-scale fisheries has the potential to make considerable contributions to nutrition, even at the scale of entire national or regional populations. And that fish can be very important in the diets of vulnerable rural groups, notably children. So to maintain and build these critical nutrition functions of artisanal or small-scale fisheries, reforms are needed that put nutrition outcomes squarely in the center of management approaches. This is only possible when people-centered human rights approaches to management can be implemented. So how are small-scale fisheries governed in the same place? Let's take a look. And here is not only nutrition, but in reality, all the contributions you just heard about are embedded in a diversity of governance systems around the world. Next, please. In this section, I will show you some of the highlights from the governance research portion of the project, which I led with the support of an excellent group of colleagues and students, and to provide a first synthesis of the emerging global understanding of how these fisheries are governed. We focused on key messages related to the contributions of fishing organizations, status of co-management, and the policy level of influence of co-management. Regarding fishing organizations, we created a database of more than 700 fishing organizations of different types. 400 of them are producer organizations, represented in the red dots that you see on the screen. And I'm focusing on those here. We did a study of the goals of those fishing organizations, and we compared those to the goals and the themes of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. We found, not surprisingly, that practically all organizations expressed goals related to harvesting and sustainable fisheries management. But what is more interesting is that, and less expected, is that 60% of those organizations also expressed goals related to human well-being, whether it was labor rights or related to food security or to human and environmental health. 3 points emerge from here. One is that indeed there is high alignment between the goals of fishers and the goals of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which shouldn't be surprising because the guidelines were the result of an extensive consultation process and therefore should be an expression of fishers' aspirations. The second point is that fishers see high compatibility between sustainable fisheries management and human well-being. And the third one, and most relevant, is that fishers see themselves as active contributors to the implementation of the guidelines and not passive recipients of state action. The second study was related to gaining a sense of the global status of co-management. That was made possible because we were able to link policies with the amount of catch that those policies govern. And that way we were able to gain a sense of the relevance or importance of policies in terms of the catch each policy influenced. In this case, it was the amount of catch under co-management provisions. And so for 55% of the global small-scale fisheries catch, we were able to determine that for every 10 metric tons of catch, there is formal co-management provisions in 4 of them. And for 2, there is the perception by experts that there is high participation of fishers. In other words, for every 10, there is 4 for which there are formal co-management provisions and 2 where implementation is thought to be happening. Now, we disaggregated the data by world regions, and we see that Africa shows the highest gap between catch with co-management provisions and catch where there is perceived to be high engagement of fishers or implementation. The third study focused on finding which policy supported most co-management. At the national level, we see the same proportion that I described before. Same at the subnational level. Now, the different size of fish is to remind us that the more catch is under the influence of national level policies. And at the local level, we see that this proportion flips. There are many more policies with formal co-management provisions and higher perception of implementation of co-management on the ground. So the lessons that emerge are these. We see the evidence that fishers are active contributors to the implementation of the guidelines. Co-management is on the rise worldwide compared to 30 years ago. However, much more remains to be done to turn what is in writing to implementation on the ground. Most co-management comes from local level policies, while national level policies often do not include co-management provisions. A better alignment is needed then between national and local level policies in terms of co-management. Facilitating the participation of fishers in decision-making processes at local as well as at national levels is key to strengthen the implementation of the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And strengthening the implementation of the guidelines is key to catalyze the numerous contributions that small-scale fisheries make to sustainable development, as you have heard throughout this presentation. So, other findings included in the governance chapter are shown in this slide. In the interest of time, we will only describe the most recent work we're conducting in relation to preferential access areas. These are areas that countries have legally designated for preferential use of small-scale fisheries within national waters or exclusive economic zones. This work directly addresses the concern of Sustainable Development SDG 14B, which seeks to ensure access to marine resources and markets for small-scale fisheries. So in the next section, we explore the question, how much access small-scale fishers have to the preferential access areas around the world. This work is in collaboration with Pat Halpin's Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, and which Sarah Deland, a former CEM and now staff at the lab, will present next.
Thanks, Javier. As he said, my name is Sarah Deland, and I worked with the team at Duke University to investigate preferential access areas for small-scale fisheries. The first step in this work was to look up the countries that have designated preferential access areas in the FAO-LEX, which is a legislative and policy database, and record what the boundaries are and what activities are restricted or allowed within those boundaries. This information was then translated to geospatial data to understand the distribution of preferential access areas across the world's marine waters. All 185 coastal countries and island nations were reviewed in FAO-LEX, and 47 of those have designated preferential access areas for small-scale fisheries. These areas account for 1.5% of the world's national marine waters, otherwise known as exclusive economic zones. 4% of the world's continental shelf, which are relatively shallow waters commonly sought for fishing activities, have been set aside for small-scale fishing access. When we look at preferential access areas by income level, defined by the World Bank, low and lower middle income countries have dedicated more of their total exclusive economic zones to small-scale fisheries access. In this figure, you can see that low, lower middle, and upper middle income level countries have all designated over 1.5% of their exclusive economic zones to preferential access areas, which is higher than the global percentage of preferential access areas in exclusive economic zones, seen as the black vertical line in the figure. Only high income level countries have less than 1% of their total exclusive economic zone set aside for small scale fishing access. When looking at preferential access area distribution by world region, Asia and Africa have set aside more than 1.5% of their total exclusive economic zone area for small scale fishing access, whereas Oceania matches the global percentage and the Americas fall below the global total. Europe has little to no area designated for preferential access. To illustrate some of the potential applications of this research, we zoom into West Africa. Of the 16 countries in the West African subregion, 9 have designated preferential access areas, which can be seen in orange on this map. In red, you can now see the boundary of the exclusive economic zones of countries with designated preferential access areas. In the figure on the right, the total percent of each exclusive economic zone that is set aside for small-scale fishing can be seen, while the red vertical line denotes the global exclusive economic zone preferential access area coverage. All the Western African countries besides Cabo Verde have dedicated more than 1.5% of their exclusive economic zone to small-scale fishing access. Now the continental shelf has been added to the map in blue, and the figure on the right shows the total percent of the continental shelf area of each country that has a designated preferential access area, with the global percentage shown in red. All of these countries have set aside more than 4% of their continental shelf area for small-scale fishing access. Next, we will look at global fishing effort in relation to preferential access areas in West Africa. But first, I'm going to orient you to the data that we use to assess fishing effort. This data is collected by Global Fishing Watch from automatic identification systems, or AIS, on large fishing vessels, the majority of which are over 24 meters in length. This data is then filtered to eliminate non-fishing activities for each vessel, such as transiting, to provide an apparent fishing effort. To be clear, the fishing effort does not reflect small-scale fishing effort and only reflects effort for large-scale vessels that are equipped with automatic identification systems, which merely represent a fraction of fishing vessels operating in the oceans. Each point on this map is a sum of the total apparent fishing effort for that location for the entire year of 2019. With this data layer, we can assess apparent fishing effort within and around preferential access areas. For these countries in West Africa, the percentage of the apparent effort in 2019 within preferential access areas ranged from 0.1 to 26.5%. So there are some limitations about the conclusions that can be drawn from these values. One such limitation is incomplete filtering of vessels transiting to port, which often brings vessels through nearshore preferential access areas. This and other limitations can be expanded on in the Q&A session if anyone is interested. One of the main drivers of apparent fishing effort in this region is oceanic features, such as upwelling zones near the Senegal and Guinea-Bissau coasts, where apparent fishing effort is higher. When we zoom into one country in particular, Liberia, we can see that fishing effort is also closely following the preferential access area boundary. In blue, you can see the continental shelf, which can often be a driver of fishing effort concentration, but clearly here you can see that the preferential access area boundary is being very closely followed by fishers in AIS transmitting vessels. Specifically, almost 47% of apparent fishing effort in Liberia in 2019 occurred within 10 kilometers of the preferential access area boundary. This provides just a snapshot of apparent fishing effort and serves as a good example of how these data sources may be applied in the future.
Thank you, Sarah, for illustrating new ways in which we can understand patterns of human use relevant to issues of access and tenure. In closing, for the governance section then, our overall findings help us visualize that while some progress has been made, there's still work to be done to increase access and the participation of fishers in the governance of small-scale fisheries. However, altogether, IHH is providing a more integrated understanding of the role that small-scale fisheries play in coastal marine environments, and why increasing understanding and investments in management of small-scale fisheries is relevant beyond the monetary value of the catch. Small-scale fisheries are a key human activity for the future of environmental conservation, food security, and poverty alleviation in coastal areas around the world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, all of you. My name is Rebecca Vidra. I'm a faculty member at the Nicholas School and a colleague of some of these folks on the call. And I'm reminded of how incredible collaborative research can be. And so I wanted to start with a question for you all about, you have all of this data, all of these people working on this project. What were some of the findings that were surprising to you as you put together this story? Start there.
I'll start briefly and then pass to Nicole to come in. But I guess just very quickly, the findings that most surprised me, we were able to get some information, at least from the area where I worked on livelihoods, on subsistence fishing, and getting a sense of how prevalent subsistence fishing is for so many people around the world was a surprise to me. The amount of effort taking place and dipping in and out of these fisheries for subsistence just illustrated to me a little bit the role they play in backstopping livelihoods. And that was a bit of a surprise.
Maybe I can add briefly to that. Yeah, I think it was also surprising that despite having a lot of small-scale fisheries research around the world, that there is really still so much hidden, and there's still so much difficulty to find information and to find information that goes beyond information that relates to catch, for example, no? To really the information available around small-scale fisheries, the understanding of small-scale fisheries in terms of really contributing, no, this employment, contributing the livelihoods, contributing nutrition, it's really difficult to find. And what we learned also when we were working with our country teams is that there is obviously still this approach to look at the data from one discipline, where we really need to learn to connect the disciplines, to pull out also from existing information, something that can inform us about small-scale fisheries. What we did, for example, what John was saying, we looked at labor force surveys. No? We looked at them from a small-scale fisheries lens, and that allowed us to pull out information about the employment, about the subsistence, about the livelihood dependencies behind that. But to do that, we really need to kind of connect different disciplines and different areas of expertise and data sources.
I will mention too, Rebecca, from the governance perspective. I think more than a surprise was we were very excited to be able to link policies to catch and to measure the importance of certain policies in relation to how much catch they were governing, at least in paper. So more than a surprise, that was, we were happy that our methods allow us to do that. And so that was a really happy moment. And surprising was also that most co-management in fisheries has received a lot of attention in the last 20 years, but most co-management is found in local policies. That was initially surprising. So national governments, some are supporting co-management at the national level, but most co-management, we see the stories that are in print come from local policies, not national initiatives. Yeah.
Thanks, you all. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm going to kind of combine them to sort of get back at some of the core issues that you're interested in, having to do with small-scale fishing. So, and this could be anecdotal, or you could potentially have broader sort of themes to pull from. But the idea, like, should we assume that small-scale fishing is done to support people at the family level, or are there examples that, where small-scale fishing can have a broader financial impact or economic impact on that family or on that community? Can you kind of help us understand? You had a continuum from small scale to large scale, but can you kind of understand how that sort of one end of the continuum, what that looks like?
I can start, and others, I think it's important to situate this fisheries historically, and in some places where these fisheries were, in place before any cash economy or commercial activity. This was a way for subsistence in isolated and non-isolated coastal populations, but a way of life. And so they are part of the cultural, makeup of that place and feeding the family. And then many of them, depending on the value that other populations have put in them, they become strong only commercial activities. So we see a huge diversity of purposes of fishing. So that'll be the short answer. Others can elaborate.
I could just mention quickly, I mean, the way that we were at least trying to get a measure of livelihoods and dependency, specifically on that, I'd seen the question. We had benefit in this study from a lot of labor force surveys and household income surveys that conducted at the national level that we hadn't used before, so systematically around the world. And those gave us a little bit better sense of things like household composition. So the point we were trying to make is that if you look at all of the household members of someone who is fishing commercially for employment or for subsistence, there may be, of course, other sources of income to support them, but at least we could say they're at least partially dependent on fishing. And then we were able to correct for that a little bit to see what other income sources there were in households and say, well, these are the number of household members that we might consider are fully dependent upon small scale fishing employment. So those censuses and labor force surveys were a nice new source of information, gave us a little bit better sense of how many people are linked in some way to these fisheries.
If I may add, it also depends how the fishery is organized. In many countries, the fishery is organized through associations where there's more participation of the family. But in other places, the fisheries are increasingly organized through what are called patron-client relations, where somebody that is in control of access to the fishery through a license or other form of access recognized by the state and then owns the fishing means of production, just hires labor fishers to fish for him. And so then the fisher becomes only an employee. And that is increasingly happening in small-scale fisheries through liberalization policies at the national level. Yeah.
So that leads in nicely to another question, which is really about, and it harkens to the title of your work, how much is still hidden here? Where are the really noticeable gaps in this work? What would you love to receive in your email someday that would help tell a fuller story? So that's about the information. There's also the hidden fishing that's happening that we don't know about. So maybe you could answer either or both.
I can chime in real quick. One aspect that we noticed in terms of the catch estimates and the environmental dimension was the issue of the foot fishing, the foot fishery sector. These tend to really remain hidden. These are not usually reported. So that was a really hard thing for our case study teams to try and find. And that goes for not just catch itself, but who's participating on them, what are they using, what's the composition of the fishers in terms of gender and sex segregation. That information was really, really hard to get. And I think it's definitely a gap that we identified in the study. And we know from anecdotal evidence that it's a huge aspect of small scale fisheries. So in many countries across our study, that was an issue.
All right, now the questions are coming in fast and furious. So I'm going to skip around to say, I think there's an interesting question here about covering conflicts between small scale and large scale fishing and industries. And the person who's asking, Rocky, who I happen to know, is asking about human rights violations, environmental defenders violence, et cetera, and how that might fit into this. Was this addressed in your study, or is that coming next or coming in a different kind of way?
I can jump in and
Cool.
Nicole, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just very briefly. We're not going. The purpose of IHH is providing a snapshot. So it's more providing the entry points for going exactly there. For example, what we're not doing in the study, but what we have data for and we'll do in the follow-up is, for example, we look at the quantity of employment. We're not looking at this point in IHH at the quality of the employment and the decent working conditions. But we do have, through the data that we gathered, we know that we have entry points for that. So this is something that's really important. And I think the study helps to draw attention to all of this and to follow up. And we talk about the IHH study and the IHH initiative. So the initiative will include everything that we want to do in follow-up, where we go deeper into the data, where we work at the country level to build the capacities, to validate, to dig out more and deeper, and more importantly, to really then take the next step to inform action on the ground.
What I was going to say, through the work we did with fishing organizations, studying the goals of the fishing organizations, we know that labor rights matter a lot to them, that our fishers organizing around labor rights, not only about fisheries management. So there's demand from the sector, on this.
All right, now I'll ask a question from our colleague Steve Brody at Duke about using, your connections or the study's connections and impacts beyond this. So, how will this work potentially impact or inform? His question is asking about countries, but I would say, in light of Javier's comments, communities, up to countries with their approaches to governance. And importantly, I'd like to add to Steve's question, like what's the access to this information? What does that look like? And how do you guys work together to make that access as broad as possible?
I can start in the interest of time, and then others. Well, so right now we're thinking, what is the next step? And as Nicole was saying, we're proposing to work at the national level, particularly to incentivize fisheries agencies to move away from only measuring catch. Measuring catch is a very incomplete way of managing, particularly small-scale fisheries. It might be a good way to manage other, larger scale fisheries, but small-scale fisheries, given that it's a livelihoods issue, if you measure catch, you're missing the nutritional component, the employment component, the gender component. So that's high in the things that we hope we can change. I'll stop there in case others have other comments.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe also we have, as SFA, obviously we have our member countries, and we use the opportunity to work with the governments to present these findings at the next session of the Committee on Fisheries later this year. And we really hope that in the long term, we will be able to have the sector disaggregated data to be able to really support with policy measures that are adequate to the functions of the small-scale fishery sector, which is much broader than large-scale industrial fisheries.
So with just a minute left, I want to let you all know that we have a question about how to get involved in this study on Duke's campus or elsewhere. Do you want to point folks to anywhere to get more information or to get involved?
We have a fellowship with the FAO as part of the Memorandum of Understanding. So write to us. There's a couple of students that have participated already, and there's plenty to do. So just email John or myself, and we can talk.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you all very, very much. What an amazing project. So insightful, fascinating conversation. Thanks to the audience for joining in and providing such good fodder for conversation. So in closing, again, thanks to the speakers. I do hope that folks will return to hear more from the Oceans at Duke Network about the future of our oceans. Please join us February 15th for Marty Smith and his colleagues who will be speaking about aquaculture and the global food system, challenges and opportunities for sustainable growth. And please do visit the Oceans at Duke website for details on future webinars, recordings of past sessions, and sign up for our newsletter, and check out other events, specifically the upcoming Oceans at Duke Blue Economy Summit, Shifting the Narrative from Extractive to Equitable, coming up 18th and 19th of March. Again, thank you for joining us. The speakers, thanks for putting that together, that tremendous program. Thanks all for joining us. Have a great day.